I fear eternal damnation, but I'm an atheist. Let me explain. Now, this might sound kind of weird at first, but just give me a chance to explain why I, as someone who doesn't believe in God, still periodically fears his wrath. Now, don't worry, I'm not in the process of turning into a Christian or anything like that. It's just I was having a conversation about this with a friend yesterday, and he was quite surprised to learn of some of the things that I think about, some of the things that I feel and experience. And so I thought I'd make a video about it, because I think there is a message that can be taken away from the way that I feel about this. I'm an atheist, okay? Categorically. I am not convinced of God's existence. But a lot of you will know that it hasn't always been that way. I was raised as a Roman Catholic. I went to Catholic schools, I went to church, I was an altar boy, I was confirmed, I was a perfectly good, God-fearing lad. But it didn't last. I grew out of it. I grew out of religion, I grew out of spirituality, I grew out of it all. But I never really considered myself an atheist for the longest time. It was only relatively recently, within the past sort of few years, that I realised it's all gone. I am an atheist now. I live without God. Atheist. A without theism. God. And it was only then that I truly recognised the long-term effects of my religious upbringing. As a child, you have no perspective of the world other than your own. You have no knowledge or experience of this world other than what you have already, and it's not very much. Nobody will ever be able to fully experience the world from everybody's perspective. But as a child, you're particularly credulous when it comes to believing things that are told to you as statements of fact by authoritative figures. I also think that when you're part of an organisation, especially if you're devoutly part of an organisation, it can be quite difficult to recognise the flaws of that organisation, perhaps just for lack of trying, but people tend to either ignore or be unaware of some of the criticisms of the organisation that they're a part of. So put these two things together and you have my religious upbringing. A young, credulous child who was told that he was born in sin and can only be saved through Jesus Christ. Or as Christopher Hitchens put it, was created sick and commanded to be well. But don't get me wrong, okay? This was very subtle. It's not like my education or my parents or anybody was, actively shouting at me every day, telling me that you're going to go to hell, you need to repent, you need to accept the Lord Jesus Christ. I understand that some families are like that. Luckily, mine wasn't, but I think this actually adds to my point. The people who I blame the least, the people who I don't blame at all, are my parents and family. In fact, my dad was an atheist, and while other members of my family were religious, it wasn't really a conversation that we had very much. I think my parents just trusted that my schooling and church and those sorts of things would be the way that I would learn about the faith, and they trusted that they were doing it responsibly, and so they sent me there. Unfortunately, they weren't. And what I mean when I say that my primary school and my church were irresponsible is that they were dogmatic. And of course they had to be dogmatic. That's just the nature of monotheism. It has to be dogmatic because that's the only real way to enlist people to your organisation. But they weren't overtly bad, or at least they weren't any worse than any other school or church. I was most of the stories and most of the lessons that I learned were stories of love, were stories of Jesus saving people and redeeming them. We didn't talk about the people who rejected God. We didn't talk about the people who left the faith or who went against God's teachings. But I was a smart kid. I knew what happened to those people. And it's worth noting that at this point I wasn't scared at all, because I was a Christian. I knew that I was going to heaven and that God loved me, and so I don't even need to worry about hell. I don't need to worry about eternal punishment for sin, because I would be saved by Jesus Christ. That's what I was told. But of course, being taught this inspiring, quote-unquote, message of Jesus' love and salvation, to gain salvation, you have to be in need of saving, okay? And that's why the flip side of the coin of teaching people about the love of Jesus Christ is teaching them that they're born in sin. And that's not healthy for any child. So fast forward to when I finally committed myself to the label of atheism. Like I said before, at this point I am completely unconvinced of God's existence. But I was still left, no matter how strongly I decided that God's existence didn't make sense, I was still left with an instinctual fear of this eternal damnation. It's just something that doesn't go away. And usually it's nothing for me to worry about. It's just like a 5-second blip when I'm sat on a bus looking out of a window. I'm a sinner, I'm going to hell, I'm going to die and suffer for eternity, and then it's gone, because my logic and reason sort of takes over. But when it gets really bad, you know, it can sort of keep you up at night. And this is the most frustrating thing about this condition, is that I can use my logic and reason. With every bit of logic that I have in my mind, I can convince myself that there is no hell, there is no eternity, and I'm not going to suffer. But it doesn't matter how strongly I believe that. I cannot get away from this instinctual fear that's been drilled into me as a child, even though it might have been drilled into me inadvertently. It was drilled into me nonetheless. It's horrible. I mean, it's horrible enough just having to experience these blips. I can't imagine what that must be like, living with that for your entire life, non-stop. And there are people out there who do live like that. And some of them are children. When I say the words child abuse, what springs to mind? Because if you're like most people, then the first thought you'll have is of like physical, sexual abuse. Because when you hear of child abuse, as horrible as it is, like on the news, that's generally the nature of the abuse. But let's not forget that abuse has many different definitions, okay? And according to Google.com, the definition of abuse is to use something to bad effect or for a bad purpose, i.e. misuse. Now, education is hands down the most important part of a child's upbringing. And I believe that by telling children that there is only one way to interpret the world and the beauty of the world, and that they will go to hell if they reject it, I believe that to be a misuse of education. And to go hand in hand with that, the denial of a proper scientific education in favour of ancient superstition is also a misuse of education, and denial is a form of abuse. If a child were denied food or water, you would consider that abuse. If a child were denied a proper education, you would consider that abuse. And so I would argue that denying a child the right to live a life that isn't burdened by guilt and the fear of eternal punishment is abuse. Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion mentions at one point some documented cases of people who were sexually abused as children by priests. Of course, these people were horrifically affected by the ordeals. But the people that Dawkins mentions are people who've said themselves that the psychological long-term effects of their religious upbringing is worse for them than the physical abuse of the priests. Just think about that for a second. Now, of course, I have no idea what it must be like to live with such a trauma that's as bad as that. But I know that I'm certainly not alone in saying that I don't know if I can ever forgive the leaders of the religious institutions to which I was indoctrinated as a child, because the effect that they had, I don't know if that will ever go away, and that's something that I now have to live with. And so yes, there are times where I, as an atheist, as the most atheist person that I know, fear hell, fear the devil, and fear suffering. And again, worth noting, I don't blame anyone in particular. I certainly don't blame my parents, I don't blame my teachers, I don't even really blame my priests. I blame the institution that is the Christian Church. And I feel just as strongly about the Islamic Church, or the Jewish Church, or any church that says that if you are gay, if you reject God, if you apostatize from a religion, that you're going to suffer. If you didn't at first consider this at its worst to be child abuse, I ask you to reconsider. But anyway, I don't really want to end the video on a note as depressing as that, so I thought that I would mention that it's finally time to announce my first ever Patron of the Month. So out of the eligible pledges on my Patreon account, a random name generator has selected a winner, and that winner is Matt Watson. So congratulations to you, Matt. I will be sending you a copy of Mortality by Christopher Hitchens. You guys know that I've raved about this book, and of course I'll be leaving a special thank you on the inside front cover. If you want to learn how you can become a patron, of course, links are in the description. Speaking of books, it seems that you guys want to know what books I read. A comment that I get pretty much more than any other is a comment asking for me to give some book recommendations or to talk about some of the books that I've been reading recently. And so I finally got around to making a video about it. I put it on my second channel, and links of course will be available in the description or as a clickable annotation at the end of the video. So go over, check it out, maybe even subscribe. You might like it, but in the meantime, I have been Alex J. O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.